Imagine a man trapped in a coma within a forsaken hospital deep in the Rockies. He hears voices that shouldn't exist. First, soothing words from a devoted nurse, then malevolent whispers from ancient shadows. Strange events unfold, moving shadows, echoes of the dead, objects defying gravity. Tension builds layer by layer until silence becomes the ultimate dread. But what if waking up unleashes something worse? Subscribe for more horror stories every day. Deep in the Rocky Mountains, where the cutting wind carries ancestral laments that seem to echo from forgotten valleys, stood St. Mary's Hospital, a decaying structure of bricks darkened by time and constant humidity, with labyrinthine corridors that seem to suck in the daylight and turn every step into a prolonged echo of despair. David Thompson, a 40-year-old engineer from Denver, lay there in a deep coma after a brutal accident on Interstate 70, where his car had violently collided with an icy barrier during a merciless blizzard that blinded the headlights and turned the road into a deadly trap of black ice. The doctors, with cold stares and clinical reports full of impersonal jargon, declared his case irreversible, his brain damaged by internal hemorrhages spreading like poisonous spider webs, his body an empty shell sustained by machines that hummed like nocturnal insects in a mechanical ritual of artificial survival. Yet, David heard everything. The distant drip of IV fluid falling in irregular rhythms, the murmurs of nurses changing shifts with tired and resigned voices, the echo of solitary footsteps on the cracked linoleum floor that creaked like old bones under pressure. Nurse Helena Harper, a woman of Latin descent with deep brown eyes full of empathy and determination, was the only one who refused to give up on him, visiting room 213 every early morning when the hospital plunged into an oppressive silence broken only by the occasional beep of distant monitors. She sat by the bed, holding David's inert hand gently, feeling the cold skin and the veins pulsing weakly, and whispered words of encouragement that seemed to pierce the veil of unconsciousness. "You're a fighter, David. Think of the mountains you hiked on your favorite trails near Boulder, the pure and invigorating air waiting for you out there, the sun rising over snow-capped peaks." Her touch was like a ray of sunlight penetrating the dense and dark fog that enveloped him, and David felt his pulse quicken slightly on the monitors, a subtle and irregular beep that Helena noted in her personal notebook with stubborn hope, ignoring the skeptical and condescending glances from colleagues who saw her as naive or overly sentimental. But St. Mary's hid a dark and unspeakable past, built on sacred lands of Native American Ute tribes forcibly displaced in the 19th century, where ancient rituals of healing and passage had been desecrated by greedy settlers, leaving remnants of malevolent energies that the older staff avoided mentioning aloud, preferring to whisper legends during coffee breaks in dimly lit rooms. David, immersed in his sensory limbo where time dissolved into an eternal flow of darkness, began to notice subtle anomalies, an unexplainable tingling on his skin when Helena left the room, as if invisible and hostile eyes watched him from the dark corners, or a low hum that didn't come from the machines, but from something deeper, like muffled voices emerging from the subsoil. On a full moon night that bathed the room in a silvery and ghostly glow, while Helena shared stories of her childhood in Pueblo, filled with folklore about protective mountain spirits, a cold gust swept through the space, stirring the thin curtains despite the sealed and locked windows against the biting altitude chill. David caught a muffled, hoarse laugh emerging from the rusty cabinet in the opposite corner, a sound that echoed like distorted guffaws from a bottomless well, laden with ancestral malice. Elena continued her narrative, oblivious to the phenomenon. "Tomorrow I'll bring an amulet from my grandmother, something woven with sacred herbs to protect your soul and ward off any shadow that dares approach." But the laugh evolved into fragmented and echoing words, distorted as if spoken through layers of damp earth. "He is lost, forever in the void." A shiver ran through David's immobile body, like an invisible electric current racing through his veins, and he questioned internally if that was a coma-induced delusion or something real and tangible, an entity manifesting for the first time to test him. The monitors flickered erratically, lines zigzagging on the green fluorescent screen like agitated snakes, and Elena frowned, adjusting the cables and tubes with hands that trembled slightly from accumulated fatigue. "Stay with me, David. Breathe slowly," she murmured. But the laugh persisted in his mind, now a repetitive and hypnotic echo. "Pain, eternal pain, without end." David yearned for movement, for a scream to break the silence, but the coma imprisoned him in a cruel web of immobility. And when Elena finally left, leaving the room empty, the space seemed to shrink, the walls pulsing like living and swollen veins, the air becoming denser and more oppressive. His condition declined in that somber hour, blood pressure dropping abruptly like a cliff, cold sweat beading on his pale forehead in drops that ran like unshed tears. And the doctors attributed it all to an opportunistic infection the next day, shaking their heads with professional disdain. But David knew the deep and terrifying truth. The voice had begun its relentless pursuit, feeding on his isolation and vulnerability, turning the hospital into a labyrinth of hidden terrors that unfolded slowly. The following days blurred into an ethereal and disorienting haze, with Elena returning to read excerpts from books about survival in the Rocky Mountains, her voice a constant beacon against the growing internal chaos that threatened to engulf him. He responded with minimal tremors in his fingers, contractions that Elena interpreted as signs of struggle, but the malevolent voice intensified, whispering personal and cutting accusations. "Remember the blizzard, David? You drove too fast, ignoring the radio warnings about the treacherous ice." Fragmented memories emerged like ghosts from the subconscious. The car skidding on slippery ice, blinded headlights, reflecting on the snow, a violent impact echoing in his mind like eternal thunder. Guilt invaded him like a slow poison, mixed with nascent paranoia that made him question if the accident was truly accidental or the product of repressed anger. Shadows now elongated on the vaulted ceiling, vague shapes that seemed like extended hands in judgment. And Elena noticed red marks on his arm, like impressions from something incorporeal, cleaning them with antiseptic while whispering low prayers. The hospital vibrated with hidden and unnameable energies, doors creaking alone in deserted corridors, and David felt the presence approaching slowly, an invisible predator testing the limits of his fragile sanity. The tension mounted subtly, but inexorably, promising darker and more threatening revelations ahead, like layers of fog dissipating to reveal deep abysses.
The presence in David's room gained more defined and menacing contours, like a dense fog condensing into solid and palpable forms, and he heard not just isolated laughs, but fragmented dialogues from ancient and forgotten voices, echoes of patients who had perished there decades earlier in tragic and covered-up circumstances. One of them, an elderly woman with a European accent, murmured about a failed surgery in 1952, her hoarse and broken voice pleading for mercy that never came, blending with moans of pain that seemed to come from the cracked walls themselves. Elena, still oblivious to the supernatural sounds that only David could perceive, brought a portable radio tuned to classical music stations from Denver to calm the sterile environment, adjusting the low volume so as not to disturb the neighboring floors. Beethoven might help awaken something in you, David. They say classical music penetrates deep layers of the mind and soul. He felt the symphonic notes penetrate his coma like tenuous threads of light, but the entity interfered maliciously, distorting the melodies into dissonant and chaotic cacophonies, like out-of-tune violins screaming expressions of pain and eternal agony. On a rainy and gray afternoon, with drops pounding on the window panes like nails scratching desperately for entry, the main voice presented itself with terrifying clarity that cut through the air. I am the Watcher, guardian of the souls trapped in these cursed walls, nourished by the suffering accumulated over centuries on this desecrated soil. David visualized a hooded and imposing silhouette in his tormented mind, flaming eyes like red embers hovering in absolute darkness, and the Watcher continued with a sadistic tone. Your guilt brought you to me, David. The accident on I-70 was no mere chance, but the echo of dark choices. Flashbacks assaulted him like sharp blades, revealing heated arguments with his fiancée Lisa, who died in the passenger seat. Harsh words about mutual betrayals and hidden secrets that culminated in reckless driving under the blizzard. Paranoia consumed him from within, questioning if there was hidden intentionality in the steering, if his repressed anger had sealed their fate. Shadows now moved openly in the peripheries of his internal vision, one of them touching the oxygen tube with incorporeal fingers, making it hiss irregularly like a dying sigh. And Elena rushed to fix the equipment, her pale face reflecting growing fear that she tried to disguise. Something's wrong here, as if the air is alive, she said to a skeptical colleague in the hallway, who laughed nervously, attributing it all to fatigue from long shifts. But David heard the Watcher laughing in unison with him, and on that rainy night objects levitated for the first time. A chair sliding across the linoleum floor as if propelled by invisible hands, banging into the bed frame with a dull thud. He felt cold and ethereal claws pressing on his chest, a pressure that left purple and irregular bruises, and the monitors went crazy with sudden spikes, forcing an urgent medical intervention with stabilizer injections. The doctors injected additional sedatives, but the terror persisted in deep layers, accumulating like layers of heavy snow about to collapse. Elena began researching the hospital's dark history in ancient and dusty archives stored in the damp basement, discovering yellowed reports of hauntings since its founding in 1880, coma patients reporting terrifying visions upon miraculous awakening, but few survived to tell the full stories, many succumbing to unexplained complications. She hung protective herbs in the room, like sage and cedar, the acrid smell filling the air and creating an olfactory barrier against evil, and David felt fleeting relief, as if the weight on his chest lessened, but the Watcher mocked with an echoing voice, "Withered herbs don't banish what is eternal and rooted in this land." Visual apparitions emerged in his mind like distorted holograms, pale faces of Ute natives, accusing eyes shining with ancestral rage, whispering curses about stolen lands and interrupted rituals. Guilt intertwined with the supernatural inextricably, and David struggled internally to emerge from the coma, feeling the limbo like a sticky and inescapable web pulling him back. One particularly dark early morning, the Watcher revealed another fragment. Lisa is with me now, David. Her voice joins the chorus of the damned, echoing your betrayal. He heard her cry, distorted and ghostly, pleading for justice he couldn't grant, and panic invaded him, his body convulsing slightly for the first time, a sign that Eleanor recorded with excitement mixed with awe. She called for medical reinforcements, but the room darkened suddenly, lamps flickering like in a classic horror movie, the air turning cold and still. The tension escalated inexorably, promising more direct and revealing confrontations, as if each whisper was a step descending into unexplored abysses. The days turned into an endless sequence of psychological torments, with Elena bringing a local priest from a church in Boulder for an improvised blessing, incense burning in dense clouds and Latin prayers echoing off the walls. But the air grew heavier and more oppressive, as if the ritual fed the entity instead of repelling it. Shadows formed distorted humanoid figures, dancing on the walls like puppets controlled by invisible strings, and David felt light touches on his forehead, visions of hidden cemeteries under the hospital emerging in lucid and vivid dreams. Paranoia made him doubt even Helena. What if she was part of the illusion created by the Watcher, a bait to deepen his guilt? The entity whispered insidious doubts, eroding his sanity fragment from fragment, and a new event arose to intensify the horror. Echoes of ancient sirens, like revived car accidents from the past, filling the room with a deafening noise that only he heard. Helena tried recording the sounds with an old recorder, but the tapes came out blank or distorted, deepening the mystery and isolation. The construction of terror proceeded layer by layer, each whisper more threatening than the last, leading to an invisible precipice where reality dissolved.
With the progressive worsening of David's condition, marked by unpredictable fluctuations in vital signs that confused even the most experienced specialists, the doctors called an urgent ethics meeting in a dimly lit conference room in the hospital basement, debating the shutdown of the life support machines with clinical and impersonal voices that echoed like merciless judges in a shadowy courtroom. Helena argued fiercely against the decision, citing the subtle reactions she had observed over the weeks, like finger tremors and heart accelerations in response to stimuli. But the consensus inexorably leaned toward the end, hospital protocols dictating a false and bureaucratic mercy that ignored the inexplicable. In the isolated room, the Watcher exploited this imminence of death with sadistic delight, whispering directly into his mind. "They'll turn you off like an old lamp, David, but I keep you alive in my eternal realm of shadows and regrets." Visions assaulted his fragmented consciousness, transporting him to an imaginary hospital basement, filled with piled-up native bones in irregular stacks, the Watcher reigning over chained souls that moaned in unison. A violent electrical storm lit up the night sky with blinding and intermittent flashes, like scenes from a cinematic nightmare. And David heard Lisa's voice clearly for the first time, distorted but unmistakable. "You abandoned me on that icy road, David. Now suffer the weight of your eternal negligence." Guilt tore him apart from within like sharp and rusted blades, memories of fights intensifying with vivid details he didn't recall before. And objects in the room reacted to his internal torment. Windows shaking as if pounded by invisible fists, glass cracking finely in patterns that resembled ancient runes. Helena, witnessing the phenomenon directly for the first time, lit protective candles around the bed, flames dancing erratically in the supernatural wind, and the Watcher extinguished one with a cold gust, whispering, "Weak light doesn't penetrate the veil of this cursed place." Shadows solidified into more concrete forms, a spectral and translucent hand gripping David's arm with inhuman force, leaving deep and purple marks that pulse with phantom pain. And he felt real agony piercing the coma, as if the veil between worlds partially tore. Helena called hospital security to investigate, but they saw nothing but an ordinary room, attributing it all to collective neuroses, which only increased her frustration. Paranoia spread to her now as she began hearing faint whispers in her modest apartment in Boulder, echoes calling her name during sleepless nights, making her question her own sanity. The entire hospital pulsed with malevolent energy, elevators stopping alone on empty and dark floors, and David caught conversations from varied spirits. A miner killed in an 1890 explosion, lamenting the collapse of tunnels under the mountains, his hoarse voice mixed with sounds of falling rocks. The tension built toward a palpable climax, with the Watcher promising in grave tones, "Wake up and face me, or perish in silence." Helena brought transparent quartz crystals arranged in a ritualistic circle around the bed, and David felt a fragile barrier forming,
calming vibrations contrasting with the chaos. But the entity laughed softly, breaking a crystal, with an audible snap that echoed like shattering glass. The nights became silent and intense battles. Visions of Ute native rituals invading his mind, with drums echoing internally and hypnotic rhythms. And David struggled to blink deliberately, signaling Elena in patterns she deciphered as pleas for help. She interpreted this as medical progress, but the entity interfered, making his eyes roll back in involuntary spasms. A new horror emerged to elevate the dread. Blood dripping from the ceiling in slow and viscous drops, illusory but sticky to the touch. And Elena cleaned the floor with trembling hands, the metallic smell filling the air. Guilt and psychological fear intensified in spirals. Visions of Lisa appearing at the foot of the bed with her face deformed by death in the accident, accusing him silently. The supernatural intertwined with the psychological inexorably, layers of fear overlapping like opaque veils, and he wondered if salvation would come from Elena or if the abyss would claim him first. Elena consulted a local shaman, a descendant of Ute tribes, who visited the room murmuring ancestral incantations in an ancient language, smoke from sacred herbs like Palo Santo filling the space and creating ethereal patterns in the air. The watcher reacted with contained fury, an internal wind knocking over light items like papers and vials, and David felt an ethereal struggle unfolding, energies colliding like opposing forces in an invisible storm. Paranoia made him doubt even the shaman. What if it was a trap elaborated by the watcher to deepen the chaos? Whispers accused Elena of negligence in her care, eroding the fragile trust that remained, and an event culminated in the early morning, monitors shutting off in sequence, restarting with abnormal spikes that simulated a panicking heart. The narrative of terror proceeded in increasingly dense layers, each revelation unveiling darker and more threatening depths, preparing the ground for inevitable and shocking confrontations looming on the horizon.
The decision to shut down David's machines was scheduled for the following dawn, with paper signed in cold and bureaucratic rooms smelling of stale coffee, and he felt the watcher rejoicing in his mind with a low and triumphant laugh. "Come to the eternal void, David, where I hear all unconfessed secrets and guilts." Visions transported him to the desecrated cemetery under the hospital, native souls surrounding him in an accusing circle, demanding retribution for violated lands and dishonored spirits across generations. Elena, desperate and with deep dark circles from sleepless nights, spent the night watching by the bed, praying in Spanish with the rosary clutched in her hands, her voice a fragile counterpoint to the malevolent whispers only David perceived. A partial eclipse darkened the night sky unexpectedly, amplifying the evil atmosphere as if the moon allied with the watcher, and shadows coalesced into corporeal and menacing forms, touching David with a coldness that burned like dry ice on exposed skin. He heard the watcher negotiate with a seductive tone. "Join me voluntarily, and Lisa will forgive your failures, freeing you from guilt." Guilt tempted him like poisonous bait, but paranoia alerted him to the lies woven into the offer, making him question every altered memory. Objects flew around the room in erratic trajectories, pillows momentarily suffocating his face, Elena removing them in panic with hands trembling from exhaustion. The room shook like a localized and subtle earthquake, and echoes of past accidents filled the air, phantom sirens howling in harmony with the outside wind, recreating the chaos of I-70. Elena tried recording the phenomena again with the cell phone, capturing distorted voices this time, digital proofs that terrified her upon playback. The watcher manifested visually for David for the first time, a tall and hooded figure, ragged cape floating like mist, skeletal face with eyes glowing like lit coals. Paranoia spread like an infection, David doubting his own innocence in the accident, visions showing him driving with intentional rage. Elena brought native relics borrowed from the shaman, stones painted with ancestral symbols, and the entity recoiled briefly, but counterattacked with tactile illusions, insects crawling on David's skin, invisible but felt like real stings. The tension reached unbearable peaks, with Elena hearing the Watcher in her mind now, whispering temptations to abandon him and save herself. A direct confrontation arose when the shaman returned for an expanded ritual, lighting sacred fire in a ceramic bowl, blue flames dancing and projecting dancing shadows, and David felt a crack in the coma, fingers moving involuntarily. But the Watcher extinguished the fire with the supernatural gust, plunging the room into absolute darkness where only echoes persisted. Guilt and psychological fear intensified in spirals, visions of Lisa accusing him directly with mute gestures and empty eyes. The supernatural dominated the environment, layers of horror unfolding like pages from a forbidden grimoire, leading to a critical threshold where reality hung by a thread. Hours before the scheduled shutdown, David opened his eyes briefly for the first time, murmuring hoarse and fragmented words like, "Watcher, hears," everything. And Elena captured the moment on video, calling medical witnesses to validate. But the entity sealed his lips with an invisible force, and paranoia made her question her own sanity upon reviewing the recording. New events emerged to heighten the suspense, walls bleeding a sticky and dark fluid that evaporated upon touch, and echoes of Ute rituals resounding like distant drums in the subsoil. The construction proceeded in meticulous layers, promising an ambiguous ending that would leave room for infinite interpretations and theories in the comments. With dawn approaching slowly, tinting the horizon in reddish tones like diluted blood, the entire hospital seemed infected by the malevolent presence. Lights flickering on empty and distant floors, patients in adjacent rooms reporting collective nightmares about voices calling from beyond. The Watcher whispered to David with growing urgency, "The shutdown is your gateway to me, where coma becomes eternity." Visions took him to underground galleries where souls formed a dark and silent army, extending ethereal hands to pull him in. Elena, exhausted but determined, secretly injected stimulants into his IV, hoping to awaken a miracle against medical orders. A supernatural and dense fog invaded the room, obscuring views and creating vague shapes that moved like ghosts, and shadows attacked with fury, incorporeal claws marking David's skin with scratches that burned like icy fire. He heard native ancestors chanting curses in forgotten languages, blaming invaders like him for spiritual imbalances. Paranoia isolated him completely, doubting all allies around him. Objects animated in chaos, IV tubes coiling like living snakes, Elena cutting them with trembling scissors. The Watcher appeared in reflections of improvised mirrors, red eyes fixed and piercing, and guilt consumed him with altered memories of the accident, showing him laughing as the car skidded. Elena used a small shamanic drum, beating ancestral rhythms to combat the whispers, and David felt vital strength returning to his limbs, but the entity extinguished the fire with internal winds that extinguished candles. Tension culminated in shared hallucinations, Lisa materializing as a translucent figure, touching Elena's shoulder, who screamed in pure terror. The psychological fused with the supernatural in intricate layers, unveiling buried secrets like deep roots. The shaman invoked Ute protective spirits with grave chants, smoke forming visible barriers in the air, and David blinked deliberate codes, communicating fragments of fear to Elena. But the entity broke the barrier with an ethereal roar, promising an eternity of torment. New horrors arose, echoes of voices multiplying into a deafening chorus, temporarily maddening the senses.
The narrative escalated to peaks of suspense, leaving ambiguous openings for theories about the final fate.
The machines were prepared for the final shutdown, cold and methodical technicians adjusting cables in oppressive silence, and the watcher exulted in victorious tones. "Welcome to the eternal chorus of lost souls, David." He saw the basement as a black and swirling vortex, native souls pulling him with invisible forces. Helena barricaded the room door with improvised furniture, praying fervently to buy time. Darkness enveloped the space like a living cloak, shadows suffocating the remaining lights, and cold touches pierced David like ethereal needles. He heard Lisa forgiving falsely, paranoia detecting the subtle tricks in her voice. Items levitated in a chaotic whirlwind, Helena knocking them down with Herculean effort. The watcher, partially corporealized, ethereal form threatening with extended claws. Guilt amplifying visions of a spiritual judgment. Helena lit multiple incenses, creating dense and protective smoke, and David felt the coma crack more, allowing minimal movements. Ethereal conflicts shook the walls, echoes of ancient battles between spirits resounding like internal thunder. The psychological dominated, David questioning the reality of every sensation. The shaman chanted powerful invocations, energies colliding in silent explosions, and David moved an arm for the first time. The watcher retaliated with illusions of imminent death, tension reaching its maximum. New horrors, blood flowing from invisible wounds on the skin, coagulating in symbolic patterns. Layers of terror accumulated, the outcome pending in ambiguity. The shutdown began at sunrise, beeps silencing one by one in a funereal symphony, and the watcher laughed softly. "Now you are mine, trapped in the limbo I created." David floated in visions of an infinite limbo, native souls surrounding him with accusing stares. Helena injected adrenaline in desperation, his heart racing in response. Shadows attacked with renewed fury, marks burning on the skin like embers. He heard ancestors demanding personal sacrifice, paranoia paralyzing him in doubt. Objects collided in chaos, creating an internal hurricane. The watcher approached, its touch draining residual life, guilt anchoring David to the abyss. Helena used native amulets, repelling the entity briefly with vibrations. The ritual intensified, David opening his eyes and whispering incoherent warnings. Supernatural and psychological fused in final layers, revealing hidden truths. The shaman banished energies with a culminating chant, David convulsing in response. The watcher retreated, but promised a subtle return. New events, echoes gradually diminishing but persisting in whispers. The narrative remained ambiguous, inviting speculations in the comments about eternal cycles. Post-shutdown, David didn't die immediately, his body resisting against all medical expectations, and the watcher roared furiously, "Fight as you will, but lose to the inevitable." Visions led him to intense spiritual confrontations, Lisa appearing as a false ally in illusory scenarios. Helena monitored closely, hope mixed with palpable terror. Darkness pulsed rhythmically, spectral touches weakening gradually. Paranoia made him doubt a true victory. Items stopped moving, creating a suspicious and unsettling calm. With fear, the watcher whispered final threats, guilt persisting like an open wound. Helena documented everything, but proofs mysteriously evaporated. Energies dissipated slowly, David stabilizing in a fragile state. But echoes lingered in corners, suggesting a continuous and inescapable cycle. The shaman sealed the room with final rituals, David partially awakening with fragmented memories. Subtle horrors emerged, distant whispers calling names. The tension resolved ambiguously, opening space for theories about persistent curses. St. Mary's Hospital was closed weeks later, rumors spreading through Boulder like wildfire. and David survived miraculously, but ever changed, hearing sporadic whispers on solitary nights. The watcher waited for new hosts in patient silence, the curse latent like a dormant seed. Helena disappeared mysteriously, her diary found revealing deep fears and shared visions. Visions persisted in nearby towns, shadows following survivors like predators. Paranoia became eternal, unresolved guilt echoing in fragile minds. The limbo called subtly, echoes inviting unsuspecting listeners. The outcome remained open, the curse broken or spread to new cycles. Whispers continue in the mountain wind, awaiting the next to hear. Theories in the comments. Was it all supernatural reality or mere psychological illusion? If you enjoyed this story, subscribe and share. New horrors await every week.